My 73rd birthday arrived with the gray drizzle typical of Seattle in October. I stood at my bedroom window, watching raindrops trace melancholy patterns down the glass, much like the tears I refuse to shed these days. 2 years in my son Nathan's guest room, a euphemism for what had increasingly become my gilded cage. The knock on my door was perfunctory, barely a pause before Rachel entered without waiting for my response. My daughter-in-law's immaculate appearance, not a strand of her highlighted hair out of place despite the early hour, contrasted sharply with the artificial warmth of her smile. "Happy birthday, Judith," she exclaimed with practiced enthusiasm. "Nathan's making his special pancakes downstairs. Your favorite." They weren't my favorite. My favorite was French toast with cinnamon, something Nathan would have known if he'd paid attention during the 4 decades I'd prepared it for his birthdays. But correcting Rachel would only trigger that tight, impatient smile she wore whenever I expressed opinions that contradicted her narrative. "How thoughtful," I replied instead, closing the book of poetry I'd been reading. Tennyson, whose meditations on mortality seemed particularly fitting today. "I'll be down shortly." Rachel's gaze swept over me critically. "Do you need help getting dressed? That blue sweater we bought you last Christmas would be nice for birthday photos." The sweater in question was a shapeless, oversized garment more suited to a woman 20 years my senior. Since my fall 2 years ago, a simple misstep on an icy sidewalk that had resulted in a sprained ankle but no serious injury, Nathan and Rachel had reconstructed me in their minds as increasingly frail and dependent. "I can manage, thank you," I said, keeping my tone mild despite the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "I thought I might wear my gray silk blouse." Rachel's smile tightened. "That old thing? It's your birthday, Judith. Let's make an effort." The condescension in her voice, "Let's make an effort," as if I were a child needing guidance, was nothing new. I'd been a professor of English literature for 35 years before retirement, had published 3 well-received books on Victorian poetry, and had traveled to every continent except Antarctica with my late husband Harold. Yet in Rachel's eyes, I was merely an elderly burden with increasingly limited capacity. "The blue sweater it is then," I conceded, having learned to choose my battles in this household. Rachel nodded approvingly before leaving, the subtle scent of her expensive perfume lingering like a statement of superiority. I dressed slowly, not from physical limitation, but from the weight of reflection that birthdays inevitably bring. 73. Not so very old in this modern era of extended lifespans and improved health care. My mind remained sharp as ever, sharper perhaps, as I'd redirected the mental energy once spent on teaching and research toward careful observation of my current circumstances. The woman who stared back from the mirror looked younger than her years, despite the silver hair and laugh lines earned through decades of living fully. I had my mother's strong bone structure and my father's bright, assessing eyes. Only the slight stoop to my shoulders, cultivated rather than natural these past 2 years, suggested the frailty Nathan and Rachel had assigned to me. Downstairs, the kitchen gleamed with the sterile perfection Rachel maintained throughout their showcase home. Nathan stood at the stove flipping pancakes with the focused concentration he brought to infrequent domestic tasks, eager for appreciation of his sacrifice. "Mom, happy birthday!" He set down the spatula to embrace me, his expensive cologne nearly overwhelming. 73, how does it feel?" "Much like 72, I replied with a small smile. Pancakes looked delicious. Rachel busied herself arranging fresh flowers in a vase, clearly purchased for the occasion and for the photos she would inevitably post on social media. "We have a full day planned," she announced. "Brunch here, then that movie you mentioned wanting to see, and dinner at Cristiano's at 6. The schedule was presented as a gift, but felt more like a program designed to check appropriate boxes. Take aging mother to suitable activities, document with photos, fulfill filial obligations with maximum efficiency. "That sounds lovely," I said, accepting a plate of pancakes that Nathan set before me with flourish. Though I was thinking I might visit the garden in the afternoon if the rain lets up. The autumn dahlias are at their peak. Rachel and Nathan exchanged a quick glance, the kind I'd become adept at interpreting during my 2-year residence. Concern mixed with impatience. "The paths will be slippery after the rain, Mom," Nathan said, his tone sliding into the careful patience one might use with a stubborn child. "We wouldn't want another fall. How about we stick to the movie? It's that British historical drama you mentioned." I hadn't mentioned any movie. The last film I'd expressed interest in was a subtitled Korean thriller that had won at Cannes, precisely the type of inappropriate entertainment Rachel thought might upset me. The movie sounds perfect, I acquiesced, cutting into my pancakes. What thoughtful planning. Breakfast proceeded with Nathan dominating the conversation, detailing his recent successes at work and the promotion he was certain to receive next quarter. Rachel interjected with updates about their social calendar and subtle reminders of their generosity in adjusting their lives to accommodate me. We've had to reschedule our Aspen trip 3 times, she noted while refreshing my coffee. But we've accepted that flexibility is part of our current reality. Their current reality being my presence in their home, a situation that had begun as a temporary arrangement during my ankle recovery, but had somehow transformed into a permanent status without my explicit consent. After breakfast, Nathan insisted on opening gifts immediately, another departure from family tradition, as Harold and I had always saved presents for evening celebrations. "This is from both of us," Rachel said, handing me a large, professionally wrapped box. Inside was an expensive but startlingly utilitarian emergency alert pendant, the kind advertised on daytime television for elderly people living alone. "It's waterproof, so you can wear it in the shower," Nathan explained enthusiastically. "And it has GPS tracking and fall detection. Top of the line. For when we're not home," Rachel added, "just so we don't worry." I turned the device over in my hands, noting the irony. A gift that simultaneously highlighted their perception of my frailty while ensuring they could monitor my whereabouts at all times. How practical, I managed, carefully modulating my tone to display appropriate gratitude. "Thank you for your thoughtfulness. There's more." Nathan handed me a smaller package. This one contained a digital photo frame preloaded with family pictures, heavily curated to show what Rachel considered our best moments together. I noticed immediately that photos of Harold had been minimized, and any images of me in my professional context, receiving awards, at book signings, giving lectures, were conspicuously absent. "We can update it remotely," Rachel explained, "so you'll always have new photos to look at even if you can't figure out the technology." I had published an article on digital humanities methodologies shortly before retirement, and had taught myself Python coding during the pandemic for a research project, but I smiled and thanked them for accommodating my presumed technological ineptitude. The morning continued with phone calls from a few old colleagues and a video chat with my sister in Arizona. By early afternoon, we were at the theater watching the historical drama, a sanitized, romanticized version of Tudor England that bore little resemblance to the complex historical reality I had taught for decades. Throughout the day, I maintained the persona they expected, appropriately grateful, slightly confused by technology, physically tentative, and intellectually diminished. The role had become second nature over the past 2 years, initially adopted to avoid burdening them during my recovery, then maintained as I began to recognize the disturbing pattern of their behavior and attitudes toward me. The truth was, my ankle had healed completely 18 months ago. My mind remained as sharp as ever, and I had begun to suspect, with increasing certainty, that my son and his wife were not so much concerned for my welfare as they were anticipating my eventual death and the inheritance they assumed would follow. It was just a theory, a painful one I had tried to dismiss, until that evening, when an overheard conversation would confirm my worst suspicions and change everything. Dinner at Cristiano's was predictable. Nathan ordered for me without consultation, Rachel documented the outing with strategic social media photos and conversations centered on their achievements and challenges rather than any meaningful exchange. By the time we returned home, I was emotionally exhausted from maintaining my facade. "I think I'll retire early," I told them. "It's been a wonderful day, but I'm rather tired." "Of course, Mom. It's been a big day for someone your age," Nathan said, helping me with my coat, though I needed no assistance. "I'll bring up some chamomile tea in a bit," Rachel offered. "It'll help you sleep." In my room, I changed into comfortable clothes and sat by the window with Tennyson again, reflecting on the day and the subtle indignities I had weathered. The rain had stopped, leaving the garden glistening under the security lights. I decided some fresh air might clear my mind. Slipping on a light jacket, I made my way quietly downstairs and out the side door to the garden, a space I had helped design 2 years ago during my convalescence, but was now rarely permitted to enjoy unsupervised. The night air was cool and refreshing after the stifling atmosphere of enforced celebration. I had just settled on a stone bench beside the Japanese maple when I heard voices through the partially open window of Nathan's home office, which overlooked this secluded corner of the garden. "At least we got through another birthday," Rachel's voice, slightly slurred from the wine she'd consumed at dinner. "How many more do you think we're looking at? 2? 3? Hard to say," Nathan replied. "Grandmother Mitchell made it to 82, so that could be another 9 years if Mom has those genes." 9 years! Rachel's tone sharpened with alarm. "That can't be right. Your mother is already noticeably declining. She can barely handle stairs some days." A performance I had carefully crafted, deliberately taking stairs slowly when they were watching to reinforce their perception of my frailty. A test to see if they would ever question the narrative or look more deeply at my actual capabilities. "Maybe 5 years then," Nathan conceded. "Her mind is definitely slipping. Did you notice how she barely followed the movie plot today?" I had been bored to tears by the historical inaccuracies, not confused by the simplistic narrative. "I give it 2 years, Max," Rachel declared. 3 at the absolute outside. "Want to bet? Loser does all the holiday family visits for a year after she's gone." "That's cold, Rach," Nathan said, though I could hear the smile in his voice. "But sure, I'll take 5 years. Her health is basically okay, besides the mobility issues." 2 years, Rachel repeated firmly. "And then we can finally renovate that bedroom into the home gym we've been planning. I've already got the equipment picked out. And the house in Queen Anne," Nathan added. "Once we sell that, we can finally upgrade to Bellevue like we've talked about. Mom's neighborhood is appreciated like crazy." "Speaking of which," Rachel lowered her voice, though not enough. "Have you looked into her investments recently? Your dad was in academia, but he must have had retirement accounts, insurance." "Working on it," Nathan replied. "She's still got all the financial documents locked in that file cabinet she insisted on bringing. I've been suggesting she let me help with her finances, but she's weirdly resistant for someone who can barely operate her phone." Their laughter drifted through the window, casual and cruel, as they continued discussing my eventual death and the assets they expected to acquire, as if reviewing a future real estate opportunity. I sat perfectly still on the garden bench, my hands gripping the cold stone, as the full reality of my situation crystallized with painful clarity. This was not merely neglect or condescension, but calculated manipulation, a waiting game where my own son and his wife had assigned me an expiration date and were simply managing me until my death delivered the anticipated financial windfall. After some time, minutes or perhaps an hour, I rose silently from the bench and returned to my room through the side entrance, careful not to alert them to my presence. Inside, I found the chamomile tea Rachel had promised, now cold, sitting on my bedside table. She hadn't bothered to check if I was actually in my room before leaving it. I didn't cry. Tears seemed inadequate for the profound breach of trust I had just witnessed. Instead, I sat at the small writing desk by the window and began to compose a letter, my academic training in clear, precise language serving me well as I articulated exactly what I had heard and what I intended to do about it. By dawn, I had not only completed the letter, but had developed a comprehensive plan. I reached for my phone, the one Rachel thought I could barely operate, and made several important calls, speaking in hushed tones to ensure privacy. Then I prepared a simple envelope, addressing it in my distinctive cursive, "For Nathan and Rachel." Tomorrow would bring revelations they never expected from the frail, declining mother whose death they awaited with such transparent anticipation. The calendar might indicate I was 73, but as I sealed the envelope with steady hands, I felt the strength and clarity of purpose that had defined my younger years returning in full force. They had gravely underestimated Judith Morgan, a mistake they would soon have ample reason to regret. Morning light filtered through the curtains as I made final preparations. I had slept remarkably well despite the revelations of the previous night, perhaps because certainty, however painful, was preferable to the vague suspicions I'd harbored these past months. The mask I'd worn for 2 years could finally be set aside. Liberation, even born of betrayal, carried its own peculiar energy. I dressed with deliberate care in clothes I rarely wore in their presence, a tailored charcoal pantsuit, silk blouse, and the pearl earrings Harold had given me on our 30th anniversary. Not the shapeless, aging wardrobe Rachel had curated for me, but attire befitting the professor and department chair I had been, the woman they had conveniently forgotten or perhaps never truly seen. The envelope sat on my desk, innocent in appearance, yet devastating in content. Inside was not only my letter, but supporting documentation I had quietly assembled over recent months, financial records, property valuations, and most damning of all, a recording of their birthday conversation. After overhearing their initial comments, I had placed my phone on the garden bench, its recording function activated, a precaution that now seemed prescient. At precisely 7:15, I heard Rachel's morning routine begin, her exercise equipment whirring to life in the room below mine, followed by the shower running at 7:45, and Nathan's heavier footsteps on the stairs at 8 as he headed down for coffee. Their clockwork precision made my timing simple to plan. I waited until 8:30, when both would be in the kitchen having breakfast before leaving for their respective workplaces. Then I picked up the envelope, my overnight bag, packed discreetly the previous evening, and made my way downstairs with the careful, measured steps they had come to expect from aging Judith. They sat at the kitchen island, Nathan scrolling through his phone while Rachel reviewed documents for a property showing. Both glanced up with mild surprise at my appearance. "Mom," Nathan said, his tone shifting instantly to the careful patience he reserved for me. "You're up early, and dressed up. Did we forget an appointment?" "No appointment," I replied, setting the envelope precisely in the center of the marble countertop. "I've made other arrangements for today." Rachel's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose slightly. "Other arrangements? What does that mean? You know we need advance notice if you want to go somewhere. Your mobility issues are significantly exaggerated," I interrupted, my voice calm but firm, "as are many assumptions you've made about me." The shift in my tone, from the compliant, slightly confused elderly mother to something altogether more authoritative, caused Nathan to fully look up from his phone, confusion evident in his expression. "This envelope contains information you'll find relevant," I continued. "I suggest you review it together after I leave." "Leave?" Nathan set down his phone. "Leave for where? Mom, you're not making sense." "I'm making perfect sense, Nathan. You simply aren't accustomed to hearing me speak plainly." I picked up my overnight bag. "My friend Carolyn is waiting outside to drive me to my new apartment. The lease was finalized last week." Rachel let out a short, incredulous laugh. "New apartment? Judith, this is absurd. You can't live independently. That's why you're here with us. After your fall—" "My fall was 2 years ago, Rachel. My ankle healed 18 months ago. I've been perfectly capable of independent living for quite some time." The calculated revelation landed like a stone dropping into still water, ripples of confusion spreading across their faces. That's not possible," Nathan stammered. "We see how you struggle with the stairs, how confused you get with technology. What you've seen is what I've allowed you to see," I corrected him. "A performance designed to test whether you would ever question the narrative or look more deeply at my actual capabilities. You failed that test rather spectacularly." The kitchen fell silent as they processed this information. Nathan's expression cycled rapidly through confusion, disbelief, and the first flickers of apprehension. "I don't understand what's happening right now," he said finally. "The envelope will clarify everything." I checked my watch, a deliberate gesture to emphasize my schedule and agency. "Carolyn is waiting, and I have a meeting with my attorney at 10. "Attorney?" Rachel's voice sharpened with sudden alarm. "What attorney? Why would you need—" "All explained in the envelope," I interrupted, moving toward the door. "I would suggest reading it sooner rather than later." Nathan stood abruptly. "Mom, stop. You can't just leave like this. If there's been some misunderstanding—" "There's been no misunderstanding. Quite the opposite. For the first time in 2 years, I'm seeing the situation with perfect clarity." I met his gaze directly. "As I said, the envelope contains everything you need to know, including a recording of your conversation last night regarding how long I might live and your plans for my assets after my death." The color drained from both their faces. Nathan's mouth opened, then closed without producing sound. "You might want to check the garden bench near the Japanese maple," I added. "The acoustics there are quite remarkable, especially when windows are left open." With that parting observation, I turned and walked out the front door, My posture straight, my stride confident and unhurried. Nothing like the tentative movement they had come to expect. Through the front window, I could see them frozen in the kitchen, staring after me in stunned silence. Carolyn waited in her sensible Volvo, a retired mathematics professor who had been my closest colleague and friend for over 30 years. Her smile as I approached was warm with understanding and solidarity. "Right on schedule," she observed as I settled into the passenger seat. "How did they take it?" "About as expected. Shock, primarily. The full impact won't register until they read the contents of the envelope." As we pulled away from the house I had called home for the past 2 years, I didn't look back. The neighborhood receded behind us, along with the carefully constructed fiction I had been living. "Any regrets?" Carolyn asked quietly. I considered the question seriously. My academic training having instilled a habit of thoughtful analysis rather than reactive emotion. "Regret implies a wish that one had acted differently," I replied. "I don't wish that. I wish the circumstances had been different, that my son had been the person I thought I raised, that their care had been genuine rather than calculated. But my actions, given the reality I discovered? No regrets." Carolyn nodded, understanding perfectly as she always had. We drove in companionable silence toward Seattle's Queen Anne neighborhood, where my new apartment awaited, a building specifically designed for active seniors, with cultural programs, a library, and proximity to the art museum, where I had recently been invited to lecture on Victorian literature's influence on modern feminist thought. The envelope I'd left behind contained not just evidence of their betrayal, but a comprehensive accounting of my resources and revised plans. They would learn that the house in Queen Anne, the one they'd discussed selling after my death, had already been donated to a housing organization supporting low-income seniors, that my investment portfolio, significantly larger than they had estimated, had been restructured with the bulk directed to educational charities and cultural institutions. Most importantly, they would discover that I had heard and understood exactly how they viewed me, as a depreciating asset with an expiration date rather than a person deserving of genuine care and respect. The letter I'd composed contained no hysterics, no dramatic accusations, just the precise, measured language of a scholar presenting evidence and drawing logical conclusions. The emotional impact would come not from overwrought sentences, but from the stark reality of their own words played back to them, their casual cruelty preserved in digital clarity. As we crossed the bridge toward my new beginning, I touched the pearls at my ears, Harold's gift from a lifetime of genuine partnership and respect. He would have been appalled by Nathan's behavior, but proud of my response. Not revenge, but consequence. Not emotional reaction, but strategic recalibration. "Your new place has that reading nook you wanted," Carolyn mentioned as we neared Queen Anne. "Perfect light for poetry." I smiled, feeling the weight of performance lifting with each mile. "Tennyson to start, I think. Then perhaps something more contemporary. I have rather a lot of reading to catch up on." The envelope was behind me now, doing its necessary work. Ahead lay a future I was finally free to shape on my own terms. All 73 years of hard-won wisdom and independence fully reclaimed. My new apartment exceeded expectations. Situated on the 8th floor of Parkview Residences, it offered sweeping views of the Seattle skyline and Elliott Bay beyond. The space was modest, but thoughtfully designed. Open-concept living and dining areas, a compact but well-appointed kitchen, and most importantly, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves along one wall, already populated with the collection Carolyn had helped me secretly move over the past month. "The remainder of your books will arrive this afternoon," she explained, setting my overnight bag in the bedroom. "Martin and Edward are handling the delivery." Martin and Edward, fellow retired professors who had rallied to my aid with remarkable efficiency when I'd explained my situation. The academic community I'd been part of for decades had mobilized around me with a loyalty Nathan and Rachel had never understood or valued. "Perfect," I replied, running my fingers along the spines of volumes already arranged by subject and author. My system, not the decorative color coding Rachel had once suggested when she'd dismissed my library as clutter in need of organizing. After Carolyn departed, promising to return for dinner, I spent a quiet hour arranging my personal items and familiarizing myself with my new space. The apartment had been furnished over the past 3 weeks through discreet shopping trips and online orders delivered to Carolyn's address, a necessary subterfuge while I still lived under Nathan and Rachel's watchful eyes. At precisely 10 a.m., my attorney Patricia Winters arrived. A formidable woman in her 60s with silver hair cut in a precise bob, she had been recommended by Harold's estate attorney when I'd first begun to suspect the need for legal protection. "Everything's in order," she confirmed, reviewing the documents I'd prepared. "The Queen Anne House transfer to Senior Housing Alliance is complete. The updated will has been properly executed and filed, and your financial accounts are now secured with new passwords and security protocols." "And the recording?" I asked. "Legally obtained in a single-party consent state," she assured me. "You were present in the conversation, even if they were unaware of your presence. The recording is admissible should it ever be needed in legal proceedings." I nodded, satisfied with her thoroughness. "Do you anticipate legal challenges?" Patricia considered this with professional detachment. "Possible but unlikely to succeed. Your mental competence is well documented through recent medical evaluations and your continued scholarly activities. The asset transfers were completed properly, with appropriate consideration and documentation. Most importantly, you haven't disinherited Nathan completely, which often triggers the most aggressive challenges. This had been a deliberate decision on my part. The revised will left Nathan a modest but not insignificant inheritance, approximately 10% of my estate, with the remainder divided among educational charities, cultural institutions, and a scholarship fund for female literature students focusing on Victorian studies. Not vindictive erasure, but proportional consequence. "They should have received and reviewed the envelope by now," I noted, checking my watch. As if summoned by this observation, my phone began to ring. Nathan's name flashed on the screen. "Right on schedule," Patricia remarked. "Would you like me to step out?" "Not necessary," I replied, letting the call go to voicemail. "I don't intend to speak with him until he's had at least 24 hours to process the information." The phone immediately rang again and again. Text notifications began appearing in a rapid succession. "Mom, please call me immediately. This is all a misunderstanding. You've completely overreacted to a private conversation. We need to talk now." I silenced the device and set it aside. "They've clearly reviewed the contents." Patricia nodded. "The initial response is typically denial and minimization. Expect escalation throughout the day as the full implications sink in." By early afternoon, my prediction proved accurate. Nathan had progressed from calls and texts to emails, increasingly lengthy attempts to reframe their conversation as dark humor and stress relief rather than genuine sentiment. Rachel had joined with separate messages suggesting I had misinterpreted their discussion due to cognitive confusion and age-related paranoia. "They're still attempting to use my presumed mental decline as a defense," I observed to Carolyn when she returned with lunch, despite clear evidence to the contrary. "Gaslighting is often the first refuge of those caught in indefensible behavior," she replied, unpacking containers of Thai food, my favorite, which Nathan and Rachel had consistently forgotten during family meals, especially when they've invested so heavily in a particular narrative about you. By late afternoon, the tone of Nathan's messages shifted from denial to anger. "After everything we've done for you," featured prominently, along with reminders of the significant sacrifices they had made to accommodate me in their home. The irony of these claims, juxtaposed against their recorded speculation about my death timeline, was almost darkly comical. At 4:30 p.m., the building concierge called to inform me that my son was in the lobby, demanding to see me. "I anticipated this," I told Patricia, who had returned for our scheduled afternoon meeting. "Please inform him that I'm not receiving visitors today, but that he may schedule an appointment through you for later this week if he wishes to discuss matters formally." The professional boundary, requiring Nathan to go through my attorney rather than granting him immediate access, was deliberate. For 2 years, he and Rachel had controlled my environment, my schedule, my interactions. That dynamic had ended permanently. When Patricia returned from the lobby, her expression was grimly amused. He was not pleased with the arrangement. There was some rather unprofessional language, followed by threats to call the police to conduct a welfare check. Did he follow through? He attempted to, she confirmed. However, I provided the responding officer with copies of your recent medical evaluations, documentation of your lease and residency here, and contact information for your physician. The officer was satisfied that you're making independent, competent decisions and advised your son that further unfounded welfare calls could potentially constitute harassment. I nodded, unsurprised by Nathan's reaction, but disappointed nonetheless. He's always resorted to authority figures when personally challenged, even as a child. A common response when privilege is disrupted, Patricia observed. He's accustomed to controlling the narrative about you. Having that control suddenly removed is disorienting. By evening, Nathan's approach shifted again, this time to financial concerns thinly veiled as worry. His latest email, arriving just before dinner, focused heavily on the rash financial decisions I had made and the significant tax implications of donating the Queen Anne house rather than maintaining it within the family. He's finally reached the core issue, I remarked to Carolyn as we prepared dinner in my new kitchen. The assets he expected to inherit. How much did they think you were worth? She asked, chopping vegetables with precise, mathematical efficiency. Based on their recorded conversation, they were counting on the Queen Anne house, which has appreciated significantly since Harold and I purchased it 30 years ago. They also mentioned investments, but seemed uncertain of specifics. I adjusted the heat under the sauté pan. They never bothered to actually discuss finances with me directly, just made assumptions based on Harold's academic career. Not realizing he was rather brilliant with investments, Carolyn added with a knowing smile. Harold and she had shared a remarkable aptitude for numbers, often discussing market trends and investment strategies during faculty gatherings while I discussed literature with their spouses. Or that I continued and expanded those investments after his death, I confirmed. The narrative of my helplessness and dependency was simply too convenient to question. As we settled in for dinner, my phone screen lit up with Rachel's name, the first direct contact from her since the morning's revelation. Unlike Nathan's multiple attempts, she had maintained radio silence until now. I let it go to voicemail, but listened to the message as Carolyn served our meal. Rachel's voice was controlled but strained. Judith, this has all gone too far. Nathan is absolutely devastated by your misinterpretation of a stupid, thoughtless conversation. We made a mistake, but your reaction is completely disproportionate. Walking out, changing your will, donating the house, these are serious decisions that affect everyone's future. You need to come home so we can discuss this rationally as a family. The message's subtext was clear. Return to their control, where my decisions could be managed and possibly reversed. They still don't understand what's happened, I observed, setting the phone aside. They think this is a temporary emotional reaction that can be managed back into their preferred narrative. Carolyn raised her glass in a small toast. To their continued underestimation of Judith Morgan. Long may it provide you with tactical advantage. I smiled, touching my glass to hers. And to new beginnings at 73. As evening settled over Seattle, lights twinkling across Elliott Bay, I felt an unexpected sense of peace despite the day's tumult. The painful clarity of the previous night had given way to something more nuanced. Not happiness precisely, but authenticity. The person sitting in this apartment, enjoying Thai food with a dear friend, making independent choices based on clear-eyed assessment of reality, was more truly myself than I had been allowed to be for the past 2 years. The envelope had done its necessary work. What came next would unfold according to Nathan and Rachel's choices, whether they would persist in denial and entitlement or begin the difficult process of recognizing the harm they had caused. Either way, I would face it as myself, not as the diminished version of Judith they had constructed for their convenience, but as the woman I had always been, strategic, perceptive, and finally, irrevocably free. The following week established new rhythms and revelations. My apartment quickly transformed from a space into a home as remaining books arrived, artwork was hung, and familiar objects found their places. The floor-to-ceiling windows admitted abundant natural light, perfect for reading without the special lamps Rachel had insisted I needed for my aging eyes. Most satisfying was the reemergence of my academic self. The small second bedroom became a proper study with my writing desk positioned to capture both morning light and the spectacular view. Here, I returned to the manuscript I'd been quietly working on for the past year. A critical analysis of female agency in Victorian literature that I'd kept hidden on my password-protected laptop, away from Nathan and Rachel's condescending interest. "You're still writing?" Rachel had once asked, discovering me at my computer. How sweet. "Is it a memoir for the grandchildren Nathan might have someday?" The memory still stung, her casual dismissal of my intellectual capacity, the assumption that my writing could only serve familial rather than scholarly purposes. The irony, of course, was that Cambridge University Press had already expressed strong interest in the manuscript, a fact I'd kept to myself rather than subject it to their diminishing assessment. On Tuesday morning, 3 days after my departure, I met with Dr. Eleanor Kim, my primary physician, for a comprehensive health evaluation. Blood pressure 118/76, cholesterol within optimal range, bone density surprisingly good for your age, she reported, reviewing my test results. Physically, you're in excellent condition for a woman of 73. The mild arthritis in your hands doesn't appear to have progressed since your last evaluation. And cognitively? I asked, though I knew the answer. Dr. Kim smiled. The cognitive assessment shows high-level functioning across all domains: verbal reasoning, problem-solving, memory, executive function. Frankly, you're outperforming many of my patients 20 years your junior. I nodded, satisfied, but not surprised. I'd like all of this documented formally, please. Recent events have made comprehensive medical records particularly important. She nodded, understanding the subtext. I had shared an abbreviated version of my situation, and as both my doctor and Harold's before his death, she had witnessed Nathan and Rachel's behavior during medical appointments. Their tendency to speak over me, to emphasize perceived deficits, to position themselves as necessary caregivers. I've already prepared a detailed report, she confirmed, and I've noted that you're fully capable of independent living and medical decision-making. Should anyone question your competence, this documentation will be difficult to challenge. This preemptive protection proved prescient when Patricia called later that afternoon. Your son has contacted 3 elder law attorneys in the Seattle area, she informed me. Based on my sources, he's exploring options to challenge your recent decisions on grounds of diminished capacity. I had anticipated this approach, hence this morning's medical evaluation. Exactly. We're well positioned to counter any such claims. However, he's also making noise about a potential guardianship petition, arguing that your sudden behavior change indicates mental health concerns rather than cognitive decline. This was a more sophisticated strategy than I'd expected from Nathan, suggesting Rachel's involvement or outside legal counsel. The psychological assessment I completed last month should address those concerns, I noted, referring to an evaluation I'd quietly arranged through a colleague in the psychology department. It does, Patricia confirmed. Between the medical and psychological documentation, plus your continued professional activities and obvious functional independence, any guardianship petition would face significant hurdles. Still, we should prepare for potential legal maneuvering. After our call, I sat by the window, watching ferries cross Elliott Bay as I considered Nathan's escalating response. His progression from denial to anger to attempted control followed a predictable pattern, one I had observed in certain academic colleagues when their long-held theories were conclusively disproven. The greater the investment in a particular narrative, the more vigorous the resistance to its dismantling. My phone chimed with a text from an unfamiliar number. Mrs. Morgan, this is Rachel's mother, Diane. We need to talk about Nathan and what you're doing to him. Please call me. I deleted the message without response. Rachel's parents had always treated me with polite disinterest at family gatherings, clearly viewing me as an aging obligation rather than a person of substance. Their sudden concern now that financial implications had emerged was transparently self-serving. Wednesday brought my first formal scholarly engagement since reclaiming my independence, a guest lecture at the Seattle Art Museum on Victorian visual aesthetics and their literary parallels. Standing before an engaged audience of 60 people discussing complex theoretical concepts without simplification or apology, I felt dimensions of myself reawakening after long dormancy. Professor Morgan, your analysis of gendered symbolism in pre-Raphaelite painting and its echoes in Eliot's prose is fascinating, commented the museum's education director during the Q&A. Would you consider a series of lectures this fall? Our members have been requesting more literary context for our upcoming British art exhibition. The invitation, based on intellectual respect rather than charity toward an elderly woman, felt like rain after drought. I'd be delighted, I replied, aware that this public reemergence into scholarly life would further undermine Nathan's narrative about my supposed decline. Thursday morning, as I reviewed editorial suggestions for my manuscript, the concierge called to inform me that Rachel was in the lobby, requesting to see me. Unlike Nathan's angry demands for immediate access, Rachel had apparently opted for a different approach, arriving alone, without prior notification, but with a large bouquet of flowers, and what the concierge described as a very insistent attitude. I considered my options carefully. While part of me wished to maintain the boundary I'd established through Patricia, strategic assessment suggested value in hearing Rachel's approach directly. Unlike Nathan, whose patterns I could predict from lifelong knowledge, Rachel remained something of an enigma, her calculating ambition occasionally offset by flashes of genuine insight. Please inform her that I'll see her for 15 minutes, I instructed the concierge. No longer. Rachel arrived at my door moments later, her appearance immaculate as always, but with subtle signs of strain visible beneath the careful makeup, shadows under her eyes, tension in her smile. "Judith," she greeted me, offering the elaborate flower arrangement. "These are from Nathan and me, a peace offering." I accepted the bouquet without comment, noting the expensive blooms, orchids and lilies, Rachel's preferences rather than my own fondness for simpler garden flowers. Even in reconciliation attempts, their narrative superseded reality. "You have 15 minutes, I reminded her, gesturing toward the living room. "I have a video conference with my editor at 11. Rachel's gaze darted around the apartment, taking in the bookshelves, the writing desk visible through the study door, the manuscript pages neatly stacked on the coffee table. The evidence of my intellectual life, the dimension of myself they had consistently ignored or diminished, seemed to momentarily disorient her. "This is nice," she managed, settling onto the sofa. "Very you." "Yes, it is," I agreed simply. "What did you wish to discuss, Rachel?" She set her designer handbag aside, visibly shifting into what I recognized as her professional negotiation posture, the same carefully calibrated approach she used with reluctant property clients. "First, I want to acknowledge that Nathan and I made a terrible mistake," she began, her tone modulated for maximum sincerity. "The conversation you overheard was thoughtless, hurtful, and completely inexcusable. We're both deeply ashamed." I nodded, but offered no verbal response, observing her carefully. "That said," she continued, "your reaction has been extreme. Walking out without discussion, changing your will, donating family property, these are irreversible decisions made in the heat of emotion." "Not emotion," I corrected calmly. "Strategic response to new information. There's a significant difference." Rachel blinked, momentarily thrown by my directness. "The point is, one regrettable conversation shouldn't erase 2 years of care and support. We took you in when you couldn't manage alone. We adjusted our lives to accommodate your needs. One mistake shouldn't outweigh all of that." The conversation wasn't the issue, Rachel. It was merely confirmation of patterns I'd observed for months. The care and support you reference was largely unnecessary and increasingly designed to foster dependency rather than recovery. I met her gaze directly. "As for accommodation, the recording made your true feelings about that rather clear." Color rose in her cheeks. "People say things they don't mean when they're stressed and in private. You've never raised children. You don't understand the pressure of caretaking while managing careers and a marriage. The attempt to position me as both the burden and the one lacking understanding was skillfully executed, but transparently manipulative. I raised Nathan as a single parent for 3 years, while Harold completed his doctorate abroad," I noted mildly, "while simultaneously teaching full-course loads and completing my first book. But that history is irrelevant to our current situation." Rachel shifted tactics, leaning forward with practiced earnestness. "Nathan is devastated, Judith. He hasn't slept properly since you left. Whatever issues exist between us, punishing your son this way is cruel. Consequences are not punishment, Rachel. They're the natural outcome of choices made." I checked my watch. "You have 5 minutes remaining." Her composure slipped momentarily, frustration flashing across her features before she regained control. "What would it take to resolve this situation? To bring our family back together? The question revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of what had transpired, her belief that this was a negotiable conflict rather than an irreversible realignment of our relationship. This situation, as you call it, isn't something to be resolved like a business transaction, I explained. It's a permanent change based on revealed truth. I've reclaimed my independence, my agency, and my dignity. That's not reversible. So you're just done with us? With your only son? Her voice held calculated incredulity. Over one conversation? I'm not done with Nathan. I've simply established appropriate boundaries and consequences. How our relationship evolves from here depends entirely on his willingness to recognize and respect those boundaries. I rose, indicating our time was concluding. As for you, Rachel, I suggest examining why the loss of anticipated inheritance distresses you more than the breach of basic human respect. She stood abruptly, abandoning pretense. You have no idea what you're doing. The legal challenges, the family discord, it will get ugly. Nathan won't just accept this. That's his choice, I replied evenly, and it will have consequences of its own. After she left, I placed the flower arrangement on my balcony rather than inside my carefully curated space, a symbolic positioning that felt appropriate. Beautiful, but ultimately not chosen by me, not aligned with my preferences or needs, and not welcome in my intimate environment. The encounter had been illuminating. Rachel's approach, acknowledging wrongdoing while simultaneously minimizing its significance and redirecting blame, confirmed my assessment of their fundamental perspective. They viewed the situation as a temporary disruption to be managed rather than a permanent recalibration of our relationship. As I prepared for my video conference, I reflected on the subtle but significant shift I'd experienced in the past week. The anxiety that had shadowed me for 2 years, the constant self-editing, the performance of fragility, the suppression of my true capabilities had dissolved like morning fog, leaving clarity and purpose in its place. Whatever legal or emotional challenges Nathan and Rachel might present in the coming weeks, I would face them as myself, not the diminished version they had attempted to create, but the woman I had always been, strategic, perceptive, and finally, irrevocably free. The legal escalation Patricia had predicted materialized the following Monday in the form of a certified letter. Nathan had filed a petition for temporary guardianship, citing sudden and dramatic behavioral changes concerning financial decisions and possible undue influence from third parties. The document requested an emergency hearing to place my financial and medical decisions under court supervision, pending a complete evaluation of my capacity. Exactly as expected, Patricia commented when I called her. This is directly from the playbook of adult children facing unexpected asset protection by parents they presumed would leave them everything. And our response? I asked, reviewing the petition with academic detachment rather than emotional reaction. The claims were so disconnected from reality as to be almost fascinating from an analytical perspective. Already in motion, I've submitted our comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations to the court, along with documentation of your continued professional activities and independent functioning. Her tone held professional confidence. I've also requested that the judge review the recording and your detailed financial records showing the systematic, thoughtful nature of your decisions over the past several months. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning, a remarkably quick timeline that reflected either Nathan's legal connections or the court's genuine concern based on his characterization of the situation. Regardless, I felt prepared rather than anxious. 2 years of strategic patience had positioned me perfectly for this confrontation. Tuesday brought an unexpected visit from Catherine Davis, Nathan's mother-in-law. Unlike Rachel's text, which I had ignored, Catherine's approach was more direct. She simply appeared at Parkview Residences and requested to see me. The concierge, following my established protocol, called for permission before allowing her up. I'm curious what she wants, I told the concierge. Please send her up. Catherine arrived at my door, impeccably dressed in the understated luxury that characterized her social class, cashmere, subtle jewelry, and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to deference. At 65, she was younger than me, but had always carried herself with the authority of someone who viewed me as occupying a lower social stratum. Judith, she greeted me with practiced cordiality. Thank you for seeing me. May I come in? I gestured her inside, noting her appraising glance around my apartment, taking inventory, calculating value, assessing status markers with the practiced eye of someone for whom such measurements were second nature. "Tea?" I offered, maintaining the social niceties despite the unusual circumstances. "Please." As I prepared the tea service, using my grandmother's porcelain set that had been in storage during my stay with Nathan and Rachel, Catherine settled on the sofa, her posture straight, hands folded precisely in her lap. "I'll be direct," she began once I had served the tea. "This situation with Nathan and Rachel has escalated beyond reason. The legal proceedings, the family discord, it's unseemly and unnecessary." "I agree that legal proceedings are regrettable," I replied, sipping my tea calmly. Nathan's decision to file a guardianship petition was both extreme and unwarranted. Catherine's expression tightened slightly. "I was referring to your actions, Judith. The sudden departure, the financial restructuring, the donation of family property. These are provocations that have forced Nathan's hand." "Interesting perspective," I observed, setting down my cup. "You view my reclamation of independence as provocation, but not their speculation about my death timeline or plans for my assets." Color rose in Catherine's carefully powdered cheeks. "Private conversations between husband and wife are being given undue weight in this situation. We all occasionally say things in confidence that sound worse when taken out of context. And what context would make betting on my death date appropriate, Catherine?" The blunt question hung in the air between us. Catherine took a measured sip of tea before responding. "Rachel assures me it was dark humor during a stressful time. Caring for an aging parent is challenging, something you wouldn't understand, as your own parents passed when you were younger. The attempt to minimize their behavior while simultaneously suggesting my lack of understanding was remarkably similar to Rachel's approach, revealing where my daughter-in-law had learned her particular style of manipulation. "I understand more than you might imagine," I replied, "including the distinction between genuine caregiving and the performance of it for anticipated financial gain." Catherine's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's an ugly accusation, Judith." "Not an accusation. An observation supported by recorded evidence. Recordings obtained through dubious means," she countered. "Eavesdropping on private conversations hardly reflects well on your methods. I was sitting in my own garden when they discussed my death timeline with the window open," I clarified. "But the method of discovery is secondary to what was revealed." Catherine set down her teacup with a slight clink, the first crack in her perfect composure. "What exactly do you hope to achieve with all this, Judith? Nathan is your only child. This legal battle, this public airing of private matters, what possible good can come from destroying your family relationships?" The question revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of my motivations, her assumption that this was either vindictive punishment or strategic leverage, rather than the necessary recalibration of a profoundly unbalanced relationship. "I'm not destroying relationships, Catherine. I'm establishing the only kind worth having, those based on mutual respect rather than exploitation." I met her gaze directly. "As for what I hope to achieve, it's quite simple. To live my remaining years with dignity, agency, and authenticity. If Nathan wishes to be part of that life, he'll need to relate to me as I actually am, not as the convenient fiction he and Rachel constructed. At the cost of your family legacy? The Queen Anne house was meant for Nathan. Everyone understood that. The house was mine to direct as I saw fit," I corrected. "And supporting affordable housing for seniors represents a legacy I value more than perpetuating wealth within a family that already has substantial resources." Catherine's expression hardened. "This isn't just about the house, though, is it? It's about control, about punishing Nathan for perceived slights. Not punishment, consequence." I rose, signaling the end of our conversation. "If you truly wish to help your daughter and son-in-law, I suggest encouraging them to withdraw the guardianship petition and acknowledge the reality of the situation. Continuing this legal battle will only result in further public disclosure of behavior they'd likely prefer to keep private." Catherine stood, gathering her designer handbag with dignified irritation. "Nathan was right. You've changed, Judith. This calculated coldness isn't the person he described." "On the contrary," I replied, walking her to the door. "This is precisely who I've always been, a woman of clarity, principle, and strategic thinking. The difference is that I'm no longer performing the role of declining dependency that made everyone more comfortable." After she left, I returned to my desk, where the final revisions of my manuscript awaited attention. The encounter with Catherine, like Rachel's visit, had further illuminated the dynamics at play. They continued to view my actions through the lens of family drama and emotional reaction, rather than recognizing the careful, deliberate recalibration of boundaries that had actually occurred. Thursday's hearing would likely bring similar misunderstandings into sharper relief. Nathan and his legal team would undoubtedly portray my actions as evidence of emotional instability or vulnerability to outside influence, unable or unwilling to recognize that they were witnessing not decline, but renaissance. As afternoon light slanted through my windows, illuminating the pages of scholarly work I had quietly maintained throughout my 2 years of performed dependency, I felt a curious sense of gratitude for the birthday conversation I had overheard. Painful as the revelation had been, it had catalyzed this necessary reclamation of self, this return to authenticity that might otherwise have been deferred until genuine decline made it impossible. The envelope I had left on Nathan and Rachel's kitchen table had contained not just documentation and recorded evidence, but the seeds of potential transformation, for them as much as for me. Whether they would recognize this opportunity amid their focus on lost assets and disrupted narratives remained to be seen. Thursday's hearing would provide the first substantive indication of whether such recognition was even possible. The King County Courthouse stood as a monument to institutional authority, its neoclassical facade projecting permanence and gravitas. As Patricia and I ascended the wide stone steps, I felt remarkably calm despite the circumstances. The performance anxiety that might have plagued a less experienced academic was absent. After decades of lectures, conferences, and department politics, a courtroom held little intimidation value. Judge Harriet Williams is presiding, Patricia informed me as we approached the designated courtroom. She's experienced in elder law matters and has a reputation for thoroughness. She's already reviewed our submitted documentation and appears to have some preliminary concerns about Nathan's petition. Concerns in our favor? I asked, adjusting my charcoal suit jacket, the same one I had worn when departing Nathan and Rachel's home, a deliberate choice for its associations with reclaimed agency. Yes, her clerk requested specific clarification from Nathan's attorney regarding the timing of your alleged decline versus your documented professional activities during the same period. Patricia smiled slightly. Difficult to argue cognitive impairment when the subject is simultaneously delivering guest lectures and completing scholarly manuscripts. The courtroom was modestly filled. A few legal observers, several elderly advocates Patricia had notified about the case's significance for elder rights, and in the front row, Nathan and Rachel flanked by their attorney, a sleek man in his 50s whose reputation for aggressive guardianship litigation preceded him. Nathan's expression upon seeing me was revealing. A flash of genuine shock quickly masked by concern. The disconnect between the carefully coiffed, professionally dressed, clearly competent woman entering the courtroom and the narrative of cognitive decline he had constructed was momentarily visible on his face. Rachel, more composed, leaned to whisper something to their attorney, her eyes never leaving me as she assessed and recalculated. Always the strategist, always adjusting her approach based on new information, a quality I might have admired in different circumstances. We took our seats at the respondents' table, Patricia efficiently arranging her materials while I maintained calm, upright posture. Neither the excessive rigidity that might suggest tension nor the slight stoop I had cultivated during my time in their home. Judge Williams entered, a woman in her 60s with silver hair cut in a practical bob and reading glasses perched on her nose. After the formal opening of proceedings, she looked directly at Nathan's attorney. Mr. Donovan, I've reviewed the petition and supporting documentation. Before we proceed, I'd like clarification on several points. Her tone was neutral, but precise. Your client alleges a sudden and dramatic behavioral change in his mother, yet the timeline provided conflicts with documented activities during the same period. Can you address this discrepancy? Donovan rose smoothly. Your Honor, the change in Mrs. Morgan's behavior was indeed sudden and concerning. While she maintained certain professional appearances, her personal decision-making showed marked deterioration, evidenced by her abrupt departure from her son's home, donation of significant property without financial counseling, and susceptibility to influence from former colleagues with potential interest in her assets. The characterization was so thoroughly inverted from reality that I might have laughed in a less formal setting. Patricia made a small notation on her legal pad, clearly identifying points for rebuttal. "And the medical evidence?" Judge Williams pressed. "Mrs. Morgan has submitted comprehensive evaluations from her longtime physician and a geriatric specialist, both confirming cognitive stability and capacity for independent decision-making. We question the timing and motivation behind these evaluations, Your Honor," Donovan replied. "They were clearly obtained to support predetermined actions rather than as genuine medical assessment. We're requesting independent evaluation by court-appointed experts." Judge Williams nodded, making her own notations before turning to Patricia. "Ms. Winters, your response to the petition?" Patricia rose with the measured confidence I had come to appreciate. "Your Honor, this petition represents a troubling attempt to use guardianship proceedings to regain control over my client's assets rather than address legitimate capacity concerns. Mrs. Morgan's decision to leave her son's home and restructure her financial affairs was not sudden, but carefully planned over several months following a disturbing discovery. She proceeded to outline the timeline of events, including my gradual collection of evidence, consultation with legal and medical professionals, and strategic planning for independent living, all executed with clear cognition and agency. Most significantly, Your Honor, Mrs. Morgan made an audio recording that precipitated these changes, a recording we've submitted for the court's review, in which her son and daughter-in-law explicitly discuss the timeline of her anticipated death and their plans for her assets afterward. A small murmur ran through the courtroom. Nathan's face flushed deeply, while Rachel maintained a carefully neutral expression, though her knuckles whitened where she gripped her designer handbag. Judge Williams adjusted her glasses. "I have reviewed the recording, Ms. Winters. Mr. Donovan, would your client care to address its contents?" Donovan conferred briefly with Nathan before responding. "Your Honor, the recording represents a private moment of stress relief through admittedly inappropriate humor. It should not be construed as actual intentions or beliefs, and was obtained through questionable means. Mrs. Morgan was physically present during the conversation, Your Honor," Patricia countered. "Seated in the garden directly outside the open window where this humorous discussion of her death timeline occurred. Washington is a single-party consent state for recordings when the recording party is a participant in the conversation. I consider someone being discussed while physically present to be a party to that conversation," Judge Williams agreed. "The recording is admissible. More importantly, it provides context for Mrs. Morgan's subsequent actions that directly contradicts the narrative of cognitive decline or undue influence." She turned her attention directly to me for the first time. "Mrs. Morgan, I'd like to hear from you directly. Could you explain your decision-making process following the conversation you overheard?" I rose, meeting her gaze with professional composure. "Your Honor, after overhearing my son and daughter-in-law discussing when I might die and their plans for my assets afterward, I recognized that my living situation required immediate reconsideration. Rather than reacting emotionally, I spent several weeks gathering information, consulting appropriate professionals, and developing a strategic plan for independence. During your 2 years living with your son, did you require the level of assistance they provided?" the judge asked. "No, Your Honor. My initial ankle injury healed approximately 18 months ago. I maintained the appearance of greater dependency as I observed increasingly concerning patterns of behavior and attitudes toward me." "A deception, then?" she probed, though her tone suggested professional curiosity rather than criticism. "A test, Your Honor, to determine whether they would recognize improvement and encourage independence, or prefer continued dependency that served their narrative and expectations." I met her gaze directly. They consistently chose the latter, interpreting any demonstration of capability as confusion or stubbornness rather than agency. Judge Williams nodded thoughtfully before addressing both attorneys. "I've heard enough preliminary information to make an initial determination. Based on the comprehensive medical documentation, clear evidence of ongoing professional activities, and Mrs. Morgan's articulate, coherent explanation of her decision-making process, I am denying the petition for temporary guardianship." Nathan made a small, distressed sound while Rachel whispered urgently to Donovan, who rose to object. "Your Honor, We request a more thorough examination of Mrs. Morgan's capacity by neutral third parties before dismissing serious concerns about her welfare. Mr. Donovan, the evidence before me does not support even the preliminary showing necessary for temporary measures, Judge Williams replied firmly. Mrs. Morgan has demonstrated through both documentation and direct testimony that she is making informed, intentional decisions consistent with her values and best interests. She removed her reading glasses, her expression stern but not unkind. I would strongly advise your clients to reconsider this approach. Pursuing unfounded guardianship petitions against clearly competent individuals can itself be considered a form of elder abuse in this jurisdiction. With that warning clearly stated, she formally dismissed the petition and closed the hearing. As the courtroom began to clear, I caught Nathan's gaze across the room. The complex emotion visible there, confusion, anger, but also something that might have been the first glimmer of genuine recognition, suggested that perhaps, just perhaps, reality was beginning to penetrate the narrative he had constructed. Outside on the courthouse steps, Patricia allowed herself a small smile of professional satisfaction. A comprehensive victory, exactly as expected, given the evidence. Judge Williams' warning about elder abuse was particularly significant. It puts their attorney on notice that continuing this approach could have consequences beyond just legal fees. Will Nathan pursue further legal action, do you think? I asked as we descended toward the waiting car. Possibly, but with diminishing returns and increasing risk, she assessed. Each filing requires presenting evidence of concern, and they've now been explicitly cautioned about unfounded claims. More likely, they'll regroup and consider less formal approaches to reconciliation, particularly as the financial implications of your revised estate plans become clearer to them. As we drove back toward Queen Anne, Seattle's skyline gleaming in the distance, I felt a curious mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. The hearing had validated my agency and capacity exactly as expected, but Nathan's willingness to pursue such extreme measures, rather than simply acknowledge the truth of what had occurred, reflected a deeper disconnect than I had initially recognized. The legal battle may be won, I observed, but the underlying relationship issues remain unresolved. Patricia nodded, understanding the subtext. Guardianship petitions often reveal family dynamics that can't be addressed through legal remedies alone. The court can protect your autonomy and assets, but it can't mandate genuine respect or recognition. No, I agreed, watching raindrops trace familiar patterns down the car window. That transformation, if it comes at all, will require something beyond legal compulsion. Whether Nathan and Rachel were capable of such transformation, of seeing me as I truly was, rather than the convenient fiction they had constructed, remained an open question. The envelope I had left them contained not just evidence and consequences, but an implicit invitation to reassess fundamental assumptions and values. The hearing had closed one chapter of this unfolding story. What came next would depend entirely on their capacity for genuine reflection and change, a capacity I had once taken for granted, but now regarded with scholarly skepticism, awaiting empirical evidence before drawing conclusions. 3 weeks passed following the hearing with no direct contact from Nathan or Rachel. Their absence from my life created space for other relationships and pursuits to flourish. My lecture series at the Seattle Art Museum had expanded to include a special seminar for docents on literary contexts of Victorian art, and Cambridge University Press had confirmed their publication schedule for my manuscript, with release planned for the following spring. Carolyn and I established a weekly dinner tradition, alternating between our apartments and occasionally venturing to small neighborhood restaurants. Other colleagues from my academic life reappeared as word spread of my re-emergence from what many had assumed was health-related seclusion. "We thought you'd withdrawn due to illness," confessed Robert Chen, my former department colleague, over coffee in the Parkview Residence Lounge. Nathan gave that impression whenever anyone inquired. A convenient narrative, I observed without bitterness, having moved beyond initial hurt to analytical understanding of the mechanisms at work. It justified my absence while reinforcing their position as necessary caregivers. On a rain-washed Tuesday afternoon, I was reviewing page proofs in my study when the concierge called to inform me that Nathan was in the lobby, requesting to see me. He came alone, the concierge added, having been briefed on the situation. No attorney, no wife. Says it's important, but not urgent. He'll wait for your decision. The measured approach, acknowledging my authority to grant or deny access rather than demanding immediate attention, represented a notable shift from his previous attempts at contact. After brief consideration, I agreed to see him. When Nathan entered my apartment 20 minutes later, the physical changes in him were immediately apparent. The polished corporate appearance had diminished, his hair slightly longer than the precise cut he typically maintained, subtle shadows beneath his eyes suggesting disrupted sleep, his bearing less assertively confident than I remembered. "Mom," he greeted me, his gaze taking in the space with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than the assessment I'd noted in Rachel and Catherine. "Thank you for seeing me." "Would you like tea?" I offered, maintaining the civility that had always characterized our pre-conflict relationship. He nodded, following me to the kitchen area where I prepared the service with practiced efficiency. No hesitation, no fumbling, none of the performative difficulty I had demonstrated in their home. "Your apartment is beautiful," he commented as we settled in the living area. "The view is spectacular." "Yes," I agreed simply. "It suits me well." Nathan cradled his teacup, seeming uncertain how to proceed despite clearly having planned this visit. The hesitation itself was revealing. My son had always moved through conversations with confident authority, particularly when addressing me. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the hearing," he finally began. "About what happened, about why it happened." I nodded, allowing him space to continue without interruption. "At first I was just angry. Convinced you were being manipulated by your friends or having some kind of episode." He set down his cup with careful precision. "Rachel and I consulted 3 different attorneys about challenging the court's decision, about finding ways to reverse the house donation, about psychological evaluations that might support our narrative. The frank admission of these attempts, now stated as misguided rather than justified, suggested a shift in perspective I hadn't necessarily expected." "What changed?" I asked, genuinely curious about the catalyst for this apparent reassessment. Nathan's gaze shifted to the rain-streaked windows before returning to meet mine directly. "I found your journals, the ones you kept during your 2 years with us." My breath caught slightly. The journals, small, leather-bound volumes I had maintained throughout my stay in their home, recording observations, experiences, and strategic planning, had been deliberately left in the guest room dresser when I departed. Not forgotten, but placed where they might eventually be discovered. "You left them for me to find, didn't you?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Yes," I acknowledged, though I wasn't certain you ever would. "It took me 3 weeks to even enter your room after you left," he admitted. "Rachel wanted to convert it immediately to the home gym she'd been planning, but I couldn't. It felt wrong somehow." He ran a hand through his slightly disheveled hair, a gesture so reminiscent of Harold that it momentarily caught at my heart despite everything that had transpired. "The journals were illuminating," he continued. "Your documentation of our behavior patterns, your strategic decisions to test our perceptions, your observations about how we systematically ignored evidence of your capabilities." His voice tightened slightly. "Your precise recording of every dismissive comment, every time we spoke over you, every instance where we treated you as an obligation rather than a person." The journals had indeed been meticulous, both in scholarly documentation and in emotional honesty about the impact of their behavior. I had recorded not just actions, but their effects, the gradual erosion of confidence, the self-doubt that occasionally penetrated despite intellectual understanding of the dynamics at work, the loneliness of being physically present but fundamentally unseen. "The worst part was recognizing myself in your descriptions," Nathan continued. "Not some distorted version I could dismiss as misunderstanding or exaggeration, but an accurate reflection of who I've become." He met my gaze directly, a person my father would have been ashamed of. The invocation of Harold, whose principled approach to relationships had always emphasized respect and genuine seeing of others, carried particular weight. Nathan had idolized his father, despite sometimes chafing against his old-fashioned values regarding status and material success. "Your father wasn't perfect," I noted carefully, "but he did believe that how we treat people when there's nothing to gain reveals our true character." Nathan nodded, a flash of pain crossing his features. "The conversation you overheard on your birthday, the one about betting on when you die. It wasn't an isolated incident, was it?" "No," I confirmed gently. "It was simply the most explicit expression of attitudes and assumptions that had been building for some time. That's what I've been struggling with these past weeks," he admitted. Not just the specific conversation, which was inexcusable on its own, but recognizing the pattern it represented, the person I had become, without even realizing the transformation. His insight, connecting the recorded conversation to broader patterns rather than dismissing it as an isolated lapse, suggested a depth of reflection I hadn't necessarily anticipated. Whether this represented genuine awakening or strategic adaptation to changed circumstances remained unclear, but the articulation itself indicated movement beyond the initial reactive denial. "Where is Rachel in all this reflection?" I asked, noting her absence both physically and in his narrative. Nathan's expression tightened slightly. "We're taking some space from each other. She wanted to continue pursuing legal challenges despite the court's warning. When I suggested we needed to reassess our approach, our whole perspective really, it created significant tension. I imagine it would," I observed neutrally. "She doesn't understand why I can't just move past this, as she puts it. Why I'm suddenly questioning everything about our relationship and values." He set his cup down with careful precision. "But reading your journals, seeing our behavior through your eyes, it forced me to confront aspects of myself I've been avoiding for years. The vulnerability in this admission, its lack of strategic positioning or implicit request for restored inheritance, suggested authenticity I hadn't expected. Nathan had always been skilled at telling people what they wanted to hear, at crafting narratives that advanced his interests. This halting self-criticism followed no such pattern. "What do you want from this conversation, Nathan?" I asked directly. "Why are you here today?" He considered the question with uncharacteristic thoughtfulness before responding. "Not forgiveness, at least, not yet. I haven't earned that." He met my gaze directly. "I think I'm here to acknowledge the truth of what happened, to confirm that I've finally seen what was there all along, if I'd been willing to look." The recognition I had long sought, not of my financial worth or scholarly accomplishments, but of my fundamental humanity and agency, was finally being offered, albeit after painful catalyst. Whether this represented lasting transformation or temporary adjustment remained to be seen, but the articulation itself held significance. "And where do we go from here?" I asked, neither accepting nor rejecting his implicit overture toward reconciliation. "I don't know," he admitted with unusual candor. "I just know I don't want to be the person described in those journals anymore. I don't want to be someone who could speak about his mother's death as a financial opportunity." His voice caught slightly. "I want to find my way back to being someone Dad would have been proud of, someone you might eventually trust again." As rain streaked the windows of my apartment, casting shifting patterns of light across the space between us, I considered the complex reality of relationships damaged, but perhaps not beyond repair. The envelope I had left on their kitchen table had contained not just evidence and consequences, but seeds of potential transformation. Seeds that appeared to be taking tentative root, at least in Nathan's case. "Trust is rebuilt slowly," I observed finally, "through consistent action rather than single conversation." "I understand that," he nodded. "I'm not asking for immediate reconciliation or pretending one conversation erases everything that happened. Just a chance to demonstrate change over time." The request, modest, specific, acknowledging the work required rather than demanding immediate restoration, suggested genuine recognition of the damage done and the path toward potential healing. "That seems reasonable," I agreed carefully, though what that looks like in practice will need thoughtful consideration. As Nathan prepared to leave an hour later, our conversation having covered practical matters of continuing professional help and specific behaviors he was working to address, he paused at the door with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Your lecture at the Art Museum next week, the one on female agency in pre-Raphaelite art and literature, would it be appropriate for me to attend? To see this part of your life I've ignored for so long?" The request, its acknowledgement of past dismissal, its tentative step toward seeing me as I actually was, rather than the convenient fiction he had constructed, carried significance beyond the simple question itself. "The lecture begins at 7, I replied. If you'd like to attend, I'll add your name to the guest list. It was a small beginning, neither full reconciliation nor permanent estrangement, but a careful step toward potential rebuilding based on truth rather than convenient fiction. Whether it would lead to genuine transformation or simply more sophisticated adaptation remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the envelope left on that kitchen table had accomplished its essential purpose. The truth had been spoken, consequences established, boundaries clearly drawn. What happened next would depend entirely on Nathan's capacity for genuine change, a capacity I would assess through actions rather than words, through consistent demonstration rather than isolated gestures. As rain continued to trace complex patterns down my windows, patterns not unlike the intricate connections between parents and children, between past actions and future possibilities, I returned to my manuscript with the quiet certainty that whatever came next, I would face it as myself, clear-eyed, strategic, and finally, irrevocably free. The Seattle Art Museum's lecture hall filled steadily as I reviewed my notes at the podium. The evening's topic, Veiled Agency, Women's Power in Pre-Raphaelite Art and Victorian Literature, had attracted a diverse audience of art enthusiasts, literary scholars, and curious museum patrons. My position as visiting lecturer felt both familiar and renewed, a return to professional identity after years of gradual erasure. From my vantage point, I observed Nathan's arrival, prompt but not early, selecting a seat midway back rather than prominently placed. His attire struck a balance between professional respect for the setting and deliberate understatement. No flashy designer labels or status markers, simply appropriate business casual attire for an evening cultural event. The choice itself represented a shift from previous patterns. Nathan had always dressed to be noticed, to signal belonging among the economic elite. This more subdued presentation suggested either new priorities or at least consciousness about impression management in this context. More telling was his behavior before the lecture began. Rather than immediately checking his phone, his habitual response to any unstructured moment, he studied the printed program, occasionally glancing at the pre-Raphaelite reproductions displayed on screen. The attentiveness itself marked departure from established patterns. When the museum's education director introduced me, highlighting my scholarly background and publications, I caught a flicker of something like surprise cross Nathan's features, a momentary recognition of the professional accomplishments he had consistently overlooked or dismissed during our 2 years of shared housing. Whether this represented genuine revelation or simply recalibrated performance remained to be seen. The lecture itself flowed with familiar rhythm, analysis of how female figures in pre-Raphaelite art embodied complex agency despite apparent objectification, paralleled with literary examples from George Eliot and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. The scholarly material, developed during those quiet evening hours in Nathan and Rachel's guest room when they believed I was simply resting, now found public expression before an engaged audience. During the Q&A session, Nathan remained attentive, but asked no questions, allowing the space to belong to those with genuine scholarly interest rather than performing attention for my benefit. The restraint itself suggested evolving awareness, recognition that this was my professional domain rather than an occasion for him to establish presence or connection. After the formal conclusion, as attendees gathered in small conversational clusters, Nathan approached with measured steps, maintaining appropriate distance as I spoke with several audience members who had specific questions about Victorian literary context. When the last questioner departed, he stepped forward with a small, tentative smile. "That was fascinating," he said, his tone suggesting genuine engagement rather than perfunctory praise. I had no idea the pre-Raphaelites were so deliberately subversive in their approach to female representation. Their techniques were subtle but significant, I agreed, noting his reference to actual content rather than generalized compliment. The apparent traditionalism masked quite revolutionary perspectives on agency and autonomy, rather like Jane Austen's approach, he observed unexpectedly, using conventional forms to deliver unconventional messages about women's intelligence and capability. The comparison, accurate and insightful, caught me by surprise. Nathan had always dismissed literature as impractical compared to business and finance, showing little interest in the humanities beyond their status value in certain social circles. "You've been reading Jane Austen?" I asked, unable to completely mask my surprise. A slight flush colored his cheeks. "I started with your book on female narrative authority in 19th century literature, the one that won the Henderson Award. Then followed the references to primary sources." He hesitated before adding, "I'm trying to understand the world you've inhabited intellectually all these years, the one I never bothered to explore or acknowledge." The effort itself, reading scholarly work outside his usual interests, engaging with primary texts, attempting to access dimensions of my identity he had previously ignored, suggested commitment beyond simple performance for strategic reconciliation. Whether this represented lasting change or temporary adaptation remained uncertain, but the specific nature of his engagement indicated thoughtfulness I hadn't necessarily expected. "Would you have time for coffee?" he asked, careful to frame it as question rather than presumption. "There's a cafe in the museum that stays open late on lecture nights, but I understand if you have other commitments or would prefer another time." The deliberate acknowledgement of my agency and potential other priorities, so different from his previous assumptions about my availability and schedule, reflected either genuine recalibration or sophisticated adaptation to new relationship parameters. "Coffee would be fine," I agreed, gathering my materials. "I have about 45 minutes before my next commitment." The small cafe offered quiet corners away from the main exhibition spaces. As we settled at a table overlooking the sculpture garden, Nathan's behavior continued to diverge from established patterns, waiting for me to select my preferred seat, asking about my coffee preference rather than ordering for me, maintaining attentive but not intrusive conversation pace. "I've been thinking about something you said during our last conversation," he began after our drinks arrived, "about trust being rebuilt through consistent action rather than single conversations." I nodded, allowing him to continue without interruption. "I've been working with Dr. Levine, the therapist I mentioned, on practical steps toward demonstrating change rather than just talking about it." He rotated his coffee cup with careful precision. "One thing that became clear is how consistently I centered myself in our relationship. My convenience, my perspective, my interests. Everything was filtered through impact on me, rather than genuine consideration of you as a separate person with valid needs and perspectives. The insight, specific, self-critical, connecting behavioral patterns to underlying attitudes, suggested depth of reflection beyond what I had initially anticipated. Whether this represented genuine transformation or sophisticated therapeutic language remained unclear, but the articulation itself indicated movement beyond initial reactive denial. "That pattern was particularly evident during your time in our home," I observed neutrally, "though it had earlier manifestations as well." Nathan nodded, accepting this assessment without defensiveness. "Dr. Levine helped me recognize how that self-centering distorted everything, from small daily interactions to major decisions like the guardianship petition. I literally couldn't see you clearly because I was only looking for reflections of my own needs and narratives." The analysis echoed observations I had recorded in my journals. The systematic way Nathan and Rachel had filtered all information through pre-existing assumptions, dismissing or reinterpreting anything that contradicted their preferred narrative about my capabilities and needs. "Recognition is an important first step," I acknowledged, "though translation into consistent behavioral change typically requires sustained effort and accountability." "That's what I'm working on now," he agreed. "Practical, measurable changes in how I engage with others, particularly you, but also colleagues, service workers, everyone, really." He hesitated before adding, "Rachel found this focus challenging. She saw it as unnecessary overreaction to what she still considers a misunderstanding." The divergence in their responses to the catalyst I had provided, Nathan's apparent move toward self-examination versus Rachel's continued minimization, suggested fundamental differences in capacity for genuine reflection. "And where does that leave your relationship?" I asked, not from maternal concern but from scholarly interest in the ripple effects of disrupted narratives. "Separated, at least temporarily," he replied with unexpected directness. "Rachel wants to continue pursuing legal options regarding your estate planning decisions. When I refused to participate in further actions against you, it created a breaking point." He met my gaze directly. I'm not sharing this to gain sympathy or credit, just to be transparent about where things stand. The clarification itself, distinguishing between information sharing and strategic positioning, reflected awareness of potential manipulation that hadn't been evident in our earlier interactions. As our conversation continued, touching on his professional recalibrations and tentative exploration of volunteer work with literacy programs, I observed the careful way he navigated potential triggers, referencing the birthday conversation and guardianship petition directly rather than through euphemism, acknowledging specific harms rather than generalizing to misunderstandings or miscommunications. Whether these new patterns represented genuine transformation or sophisticated adaptation remained uncertain. The envelope I had left had created necessary disruption of established dynamics, but only time would reveal whether Nathan was capable of sustained behavioral change based on fundamental revaluation rather than strategic adjustment to altered circumstances. As we prepared to leave 40 minutes later, Nathan, careful to respect the time boundary I had established, he asked a question that suggested at least the possibility of genuine reflection. "The lecture tonight," he began, "about veiled agency and women's hidden power within apparently restrictive contexts, was that what you were doing during those 2 years with us? Exercising agency in ways I completely failed to recognize." The question, connecting scholarly material to personal experience, recognizing potential parallels between Victorian women's strategic navigation of patriarchal constraints and my own careful management of a controlling environment, indicated perspective-taking I hadn't necessarily expected. "There are certain parallels," I acknowledged. "Though my constraints were situational rather than systemic, I could leave when necessary, as Victorian women often could not." Nathan nodded, absorbing this distinction. "I keep thinking about those journals, how you were simultaneously performing the role we expected while maintaining your complete intellectual life in private. The manuscripts, the research, the correspondence with colleagues, all happening right under our noses while we saw only what confirmed our predetermined narrative. The recognition, specific, accurate, acknowledging the complexity of my experience rather than reducing it to simplified categories, suggested at least the capacity for perspective-taking previously absent from our interactions. As we parted outside the museum, Nathan maintained appropriate physical and emotional distance. No presumptive embrace, no assumptions about future contact, simply a measured, "Thank you for your time tonight," that acknowledged my agency in any ongoing connection. Walking toward my waiting car service, I reflected on the subtle but significant differences between this interaction and our established patterns. Whether these represented genuine transformation or sophisticated adaptation remained unclear, but the specificity and consistency of the changes suggested at least the possibility of authentic recalibration rather than merely strategic performance. The envelope I had left on their kitchen table had contained not just evidence and consequences, but the catalyst for potential transformation, the necessary disruption of comfortable narratives that precedes genuine change. Whether Nathan would translate these initial shifts into sustained behavioral patterns remained to be seen, but the preliminary evidence offered measured reason for cautious optimism. Not reconciliation, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of a path toward authentic relationship based on mutual recognition rather than convenient fiction. Winter settled over Seattle with characteristic persistence. Gray skies, steady rain, occasional crystalline days when Mount Rainier emerged from cloud cover in breathtaking clarity. The seasonal shift mirrored transitions in my own life as new patterns established themselves with increasing solidity. My manuscript had entered final production phases with Cambridge University Press, with page proofs and index preparation occupying pleasant hours in my study. The Seattle Art Museum had extended my lecture series through spring, and 2 universities had inquired about guest teaching opportunities for specialized seminars. More surprising was the evolution of my relationship with Nathan. Following the museum lecture, he had maintained measured, consistent contact, neither intrusive nor performative, but characterized by genuine attention to appropriate boundaries. Weekly emails with no expectation of immediate response. Occasional invitations to lectures or exhibits aligned with my actual interests rather than his assumptions. small gestures of recognition without presumption of accelerated reconciliation. Most telling was his behavior during our limited in-person interactions. Gone was the condescending patience, the subtle infantilization, the constant checking and correcting. In their place emerged attentive listening, appropriate deference to my expertise in certain areas, and perhaps most significantly, comfort with silence, the ability to simply be present without filling space with self-reference or control. Whether these changes represented fundamental transformation or sophisticated adaptation remained uncertain, but their consistency across multiple contexts suggested at least the possibility of genuine recalibration rather than merely strategic performance. On a clear December morning, as I reviewed correspondence in my study, an unexpected email arrived from Rachel, the first direct communication since her visit to my apartment 3 months earlier. "Judith, I hope this message finds you well. After considerable reflection, I believe it's time we spoke directly rather than through intermediaries. While Nathan and I continue to have different perspectives on recent events, I recognize that our relationship deserves the opportunity for direct dialogue beyond initial reactions and assumptions. Would you be open to meeting for lunch next week at a location of your choosing? I understand if you prefer not to meet or would rather have Nathan present, but I believe a private conversation might allow for more authentic exchange. Respectfully, Rachel." The measured tone, acknowledgement of my preferences, and absence of manipulative language marked departure from Rachel's previous communications. Whether this represented genuine evolution or simply more sophisticated approach remained unclear, but the initiative itself warranted thoughtful consideration. After consulting with Patricia, who recommended meeting in a public location with clear time boundaries, I responded accepting the invitation and suggesting a restaurant near the art museum, timing the meeting before my afternoon lecture to create natural conclusion. Rachel arrived precisely on time, her appearance as immaculate as ever but subtly modified, less overtly expensive accessories, more understated makeup, clothing that signaled professional competence rather than status display. The adjustments themselves suggested either evolving priorities or at least awareness of how previous presentation might be perceived in our new relational context. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she began once we were seated, her tone carefully modulated. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since our last conversation." "I appreciate your reaching out," I replied neutrally, observing her with scholarly interest rather than emotional investment. Rachel's hands betrayed subtle tension as she arranged her napkin with unnecessary precision. "I want to be direct about my purpose today," she continued, "not to negotiate Nathan's relationship with you or to revisit legal matters, but to address our relationship specifically. The distinction, focusing on our direct connection rather than triangulating through Nathan, represented departure from established patterns, suggesting at least the possibility of independent reflection rather than coordinated strategy. "When Nathan found your journals," she continued, "he shared certain passages with me, specifically your observations about my behavior and its impact on you. I initially dismissed them as exaggeration or misinterpretation." Her gaze met mine directly. "It was easier to attribute your perceptions to cognitive decline or emotional sensitivity than to acknowledge the accuracy of your observations. The admission, specific, direct, acknowledging active choice to dismiss valid perspective, suggested capacity for self-examination I hadn't necessarily attributed to Rachel, whose previous approaches had consistently centered external factors rather than internal responsibility. "What changed?" I asked, genuinely curious about the catalyst for this apparent shift. "Multiple factors," she replied with unexpected thoughtfulness. "The court's unequivocal rejection of our narrative about your capacity, Nathan's evolving perspective and separation from our shared assumptions, conversations with my own mother, who reluctantly acknowledged similarities between my treatment of you and patterns in her relationships. Most surprising was her next admission. I also read your book on narrative authority in 19th century literature. The parallels between Victorian dismissal of women's intellectual capacity and my own behavior toward you were uncomfortably clear. The specific reference to my scholarly work, Engagement with actual content, rather than superficial acknowledgement, suggested effort beyond strategic performance. Whether this represented genuine interest or calculated approach remained unclear, but the specificity itself indicated attention to actual substance rather than merely external form. "I'm not here to request forgiveness or immediate reconciliation," Rachel continued, echoing Nathan's measured approach. "Just to acknowledge directly that your assessment of my behavior was fundamentally accurate, however uncomfortable that recognition has been." The acknowledgement, unqualified by minimization or redirection, represented significant departure from her previous positioning of events as misunderstanding rather than meaningful breach. "I appreciate your directness," I replied, maintaining scholarly detachment rather than premature emotional investment. Recognition of patterns is an important first step, though translation into consistent behavioral change typically requires sustained effort and accountability. "That's what I'm working on now," she agreed, the echo of Nathan's phrasing suggesting shared therapeutic language, if not necessarily shared insight. "I've started seeing Dr. Winters, not your attorney Patricia," she clarified with small smile, "but her sister Susan, who specializes in family systems therapy." The specific reference, acknowledging the potential confusion of names while demonstrating awareness of my connections, suggested attention to detail previously absent from our interactions, where Rachel had consistently demonstrated minimal interest in the specifics of my professional or personal networks. As our conversation continued through lunch, I observed subtle but significant shifts in Rachel's communication patterns. Direct acknowledgement of specific behaviors, rather than generalized references to misunderstandings. Comfort with my academic identity, rather than attempts to redirect toward familiar domestic roles. Perhaps most tellingly, capacity to reference the birthday conversation directly rather than through euphemism or minimization. "When you overheard us discussing when you might die," she said near the end of our meal, maintaining eye contact despite visible discomfort, "it revealed the worst version of who I'd become. Someone who viewed relationships primarily through transactional lens rather than genuine connection." The specificity of this self-assessment, connecting behavioral patterns to underlying values rather than dismissing isolated incidents, suggested capacity for reflection beyond what I had initially attributed to Rachel, whose previous approaches had consistently prioritized impression management over substantive examination. "May I ask you something directly?" she continued after brief pause. "Something I've been wondering since reading those journal passages." I nodded, curious about her direction. "During those 2 years living with us, was there ever a moment when you considered simply confronting us directly? Before the birthday conversation, I mean. Before the evidence became impossible to dismiss." The question itself, centering my decision-making process rather than her experience of consequences, represented shift from previous patterns where Rachel had consistently prioritized her perspective over genuine curiosity about mine. "I considered direct confrontation several times," I acknowledged, but each experimental attempt at asserting independence or capability was so quickly dismissed as confusion or stubbornness that more direct approaches seemed unlikely to penetrate the narrative you'd constructed. Rachel nodded, accepting this assessment without defensiveness. "We created an environment where your actual voice couldn't be heard, then used your resulting strategic silence as confirmation of our assumptions." Her precise articulation of the dynamic suggested either genuine insight or sophisticated therapeutic language. It was a perfect closed system. "Until it wasn't," I observed. "Until it wasn't," she agreed, a flash of something like respect crossing her features. "The envelope you left, it was masterfully constructed. The evidence, the timing, the strategic departure without opportunity for immediate manipulation or control. If I weren't on the receiving end, I might admire the precision of it. The acknowledgement, recognizing tactical effectiveness without resentment or victimhood, suggested evolving capacity to see beyond immediate self-interest to broader patterns at work." As our lunch concluded and we prepared to part, Rachel maintained appropriate boundaries. No presumptive plans for future contact, no assumptions about accelerated reconciliation, simply measured acknowledgement of the conversation itself. "Thank you for meeting today," she said as we exited the restaurant. "I know trust is rebuilt through consistent action rather than single conversations. I just wanted to establish direct acknowledgement as foundation for whatever comes next. Walking toward the museum for my afternoon lecture, I reflected on the subtle but significant differences between this interaction and our established patterns. Whether these represented genuine transformation or sophisticated adaptation remained uncertain, but the specificity and thoughtfulness of Rachel's approach suggested at least the possibility of authentic reflection rather than merely strategic performance. The envelope I had left on their kitchen table had contained not just evidence and consequences, but potential catalyst for transformation across multiple relationships. Whether these initial shifts would translate into sustained patterns remained to be seen, but the preliminary evidence offered measured reason for cautious optimism. Not reconciliation, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of paths toward authentic connection based on recognition rather than convenient fiction. New territories being mapped with careful attention to both past landmarks and future possibilities. Happy birthday, Judith. Carolyn's voice held warm sincerity as she raised her glass in the private dining room of Parkview Residences. Around the elegantly set table sat a carefully curated gathering. Colleagues from my academic life, new friends from the art museum and literary circles, and in measured representation, Nathan. 74, I acknowledged with a smile. A year that has contained multitudes. The understatement drew knowing chuckles from those familiar with the journey of the past 12 months. From overheard birthday conversation to complete recalibration of my life circumstances, professional reemergence, and carefully managed relational reconstructions. The celebration itself represented deliberate choice rather than obligation or performance. Unlike the previous year's perfunctory observation organized by Nathan and Rachel, this gathering reflected authentic preferences, meaningful conversation rather than social media documentation, intellectual engagement rather than ritualized gift-giving, genuine connection rather than obligation fulfillment. If I might offer a toast, Nathan said, rising with careful attention to appropriate timing, to my mother, whose courage and clarity this past year have taught difficult but necessary lessons about seeing people as they actually are rather than as projections of our own narratives. The acknowledgement, specific, self-aware, neither performatively emotional nor strategically positioned, reflected the measured evolution of our relationship over the past 6 months. Not full reconciliation, but careful reconstruction based on mutual recognition rather than convenient fiction. Rachel's absence from the gathering was neither accident nor oversight, but deliberate boundary, my choice, communicated directly rather than through intermediaries. While our lunch conversation had established foundation for potential rebuilding, the relationship remained in early stages of recalibration, not yet ready for inclusion in intimate celebrations. As dinner progressed through excellent food and better conversation, I observed Nathan's interactions with my colleagues and friends with scholarly interest. Gone was the subtle condescension that had once characterized his engagement with my academic circles, replaced by genuine curiosity and appropriate deference to expertise outside his own domains. Whether this represented fundamental transformation or sophisticated adaptation remained uncertain, but the consistency across contexts suggested authentic recalibration rather than merely strategic performance. After dessert was served, a perfect lemon cake from my favorite bakery rather than the chocolate Nathan and Rachel had always insisted I preferred, Carolyn presented a slim package wrapped in elegant paper. From all of us, she explained, though the timing is coincidental rather than planned. Inside was the first printed copy of my book, Narrative Authority and Female Agency in Victorian Literature, fresh from Cambridge University Press with formal publication still 2 weeks away. The culmination of work maintained in quiet persistence throughout those 2 years in Nathan and Rachel's home, now manifested in tangible form on my birthday. We pulled some strings with the publisher, Robert Chen explained with characteristic modesty that belied his significant academic influence. Seemed appropriate that you should hold it first, before the wider world. As I traced the embossed title and my name on the cover, the moment's symbolism was not lost on me or anyone present. The reclamation of voice made literal in published form, academic authority restored and expanded, the work that had been dismissed as sweet hobby by Rachel now recognized with the press's prestigious imprint. Nathan's expression as he studied the book reflected complex recognition, acknowledgement of dimensions of my identity he had systematically overlooked, capabilities he had consistently underestimated, accomplishments he had casually dismissed. Whether this represented genuine reassessment or sophisticated impression, management remained unclear, but the attentiveness itself marked significant departure from established patterns. Later, as guests began departing with warm wishes and plans for future engagements, Nathan lingered with appropriate restraint, neither presuming extended private conversation nor rushing to conclude the evening. "I have something for you," he said when we found ourselves momentarily alone. Not a replacement for tonight's celebration, which was exactly as it should have been, but perhaps a small step toward different future patterns. He handed me an envelope, the parallels to my own strategic communication a year earlier unlikely to be coincidental. "Not for opening now," he clarified, "just something to consider when you have private time and appropriate emotional space." The boundary itself, recognizing my agency in timing and engagement rather than presuming immediate attention, reflected evolution beyond previous patterns of entitled access and control. After the last guests departed and I returned to my apartment, the envelope remained on my side table while I prepared tea with familiar evening ritual. Only when settled in my favorite reading chair, city lights glimmering beyond rain-streaked windows, did I finally open Nathan's communication. Inside was not the expected note, but legal documentation with post-it markers indicating signature locations. As I reviewed the contents with academic thoroughness, the substantive nature of the gesture became clear. Nathan had formally withdrawn all legal claims to remaining family assets, established independent trust for any future care needs I might have with professional rather than family trustees, and most significantly, relinquished expectations of inheritance with legally binding commitment not to contest any future estate decisions. The practical implications were significant. Complete financial disentanglement without my needing to maintain defensive legal structures, but the symbolic dimensions carried greater weight. Rather than continued strategic positioning for eventual benefit, Nathan had formally released expectations that had undergirded our relationship for decades. Accompanying the legal documents was a single page in Nathan's precise handwriting. "Mom, this isn't meant as dramatic gesture or attempt to earn forgiveness, but as practical implementation of lessons these past months have taught. True respect for your autonomy means not just acknowledging it verbally, but ensuring all practical dimensions of our relationship reflect that recognition. The documents enclosed remove any financial considerations from our continuing relationship, not as sacrifice or performance, but as necessary foundation for whatever authentic connection might be possible moving forward. Whatever you decide about our relationship, whether limited contact, gradual rebuilding, or something else entirely, should be based on genuine choice rather than practical considerations or implied obligations. With respect and continuing work toward becoming someone worthy of renewed trust, Nathan." The note's tone, neither emotional manipulation nor strategic positioning, but practical implementation of stated principles, suggested evolution beyond performative reconciliation toward substantive recalibration. Whether this represented fundamental transformation or sophisticated adaptation remained uncertain, but the specific, actionable nature of the gesture indicated commitment beyond merely verbal acknowledgement. As rain traced familiar patterns down my windows, patterns not unlike the complex connections between parents and children, between past actions and future possibilities, I reflected on the year's circular journey. From birthday revelation to birthday reclamation, from overheard conversation to published voice, from controlled environment to self-determined boundaries. The envelope I had left on Nathan and Rachel's kitchen table had contained not just evidence and consequences, but catalyst for potential transformation across multiple dimensions. The results remained mixed and evolving. Nathan's apparent journey toward genuine recognition, Rachel's more measured and uncertain steps, my own reclamation of professional identity and personal agency. Not completion, not resolution in any simplistic sense, but authentic engagement with complex realities rather than comfortable fictions, the necessary foundation for whatever relationships might evolve moving forward. As 74 began with quiet reflection rather than performed celebration, I felt neither triumph nor vindication, but scholarly appreciation for the year's complex lessons. The bitter taste Nathan and Rachel had experienced upon reading my envelope had not been punishment, but necessary medicine, the disruption of convenient narratives that precedes genuine seeing. Whether that seeing would continue to develop into sustained recognition remained uncertain, but the preliminary evidence offered measured reason for cautious optimism. Not reconciliation in any simple sense, but potential foundation for relationships based on mutual recognition rather than convenient fiction. The birthday that had catalyzed painful revelations had come full circle to quiet celebration of authentic identity. The envelope that had delivered necessary truth had been answered with formal acknowledgement of autonomy. The overheard conversation about my anticipated death had given way to recognition of my very much living agency and voice. As I set Nathan's documents aside for formal review with Patricia, I felt the weight of performance lifting with familiar relief, the freedom that comes from being seen, however imperfectly, rather than strategically misperceived for others' convenience. Whatever came next would unfold according to authentic choices rather than obligatory patterns or strategic calculations. The irony was not lost on me, that it had taken overhearing my son and his wife betting on my death to fully reclaim the vibrancy of my life, that the bitter taste they had experienced that morning had become, in its own way, necessary medicine for us all. Not ending, but beginning. Not conclusion, but continuation with clearer vision and firmer boundaries. Not fairy tale reconciliation, but authentic engagement with complex realities, the necessary foundation for whatever relationships might evolve in the chapters yet to be written. The end.